Today we will introduce our basic findings about the project on the effects of the Syrian crisis on neighboring countries. We focused on the 4 neighboring countries in terms of some basic issues. As all we can see, we have one crisis and 4 neighbors, but we have also similar and interrelated effects. I mean the refugee effect or the migration effect. We have the effects on state structure in each country. We have the radicalization effect. We have the social effects and economic effects, and also security-related effects. But in terms of neighboring countries, we have all different outcomes regarding the sui generis nature of the neighboring countries. So I will mostly focus on Lebanon and Iraq, while Oytun will focus on Jordan and Turkey parts. Starting from Iraq, I can say that migration maybe is one of the least important issue for Iraq, because as we can see from the slide, Iraq shoulders the least burden of the Syrian refugees. Now today Turkey is the most populous refugee host country in terms of more than or about 3 million when we include the Iraqi refugees before Afghans and the other refugees. We are now hosting about 3 million refugees in the world. In terms of Syrian crisis, as you can see from the slide, nearly 60% of the refugees are hosted by Turkey, while Iraq receives only 5% of the refugees. And also Jordan is hosting about 14%, while Lebanon is hosting 22%. But of course, this shouldn't be considered as Lebanon or Jordan is less affected from the crisis. But when we look at the Iraq issue or Iraqi case, even Iraq hosts 5% or the least percent of the crisis. The huge burden is on the KRG, I mean Kurdistan Regional Government. Nearly 97% of the refugees, Syrians, are now hosted in Kurdistan Regional Government territories. And one of the most important points about the migration effect of the Syrian crisis is that most of the Syrians seeking shelter in Iraq are the Syrian Kurds. Are the Syrian Kurds who are displaced or seeking shelter because not only because of the regime, but also because of the policies of PYD and PKK affiliated groups. So they were somehow deported or expelled to the Kurdistan regional government. But beside the refugee issue, I mean beside the Syrians hosted in Iraq, the real problem maybe for Iraq can be considered as the IDPs, internally displaced persons. Yes, it was a reality before the Syrian crisis. There were about 1 million refugees during the Saddam era, and there were also about 1.3 million IDPs after the dissolution of Saddam regime, but with the ISIS attacks, which we considered as a side effect of the Syrian crisis, there were about now in Iraq, there were about more than 3 million IDPs inside Iraq, which will be a real problem in the day after ISIS or in the day after the solution of the Syrian crisis. Regarding the effects on the state structure, we all know that Iraq was not in a very good condition before the Syrian crisis. We all know that there were problems in terms of enabling the public order, and state authority was in question, especially in some parts, especially in Sunni populated areas. Of course, there were some corruption problems which directly affects the economy also, but the ineffectiveness of the government and the Iraqi army can be concluded as the bad governance of the state management caused a lot of problems. But with the Syrian crisis, there were positive and negative effects to the state structure of Iraq. Just think about the crisis. Before the crisis, there were presidential issue. I mean, Mr. Jalal Talabani was in Germany for medical treatment since 2012. Iraq's presidency was vacant at that time, and there were elections in April 2014, and there were ongoing discussions to form the new government, which Maliki insisted to be the third time in his prime ministry, while the other factions, groups, including the Kurds, the Sunnis, and the other major Shiite groups, were opposing to it. And there were also problems between Kurdistan regional government and Baghdad regarding the oil issue, the disputed territories, and the other issues as well regarding the status of Kirkuk, for instance. And this Syrian crisis, I mean the ISIS and the Syrian crisis, suspended the ongoing issues or the ongoing problems in Iraq somehow. And it enabled to form the government without Maliki, and it enabled to elect a new president, and we can consider as a negative effect, I think, in terms of state structure. There were Hashd al-Shabi founded or created after Sistani's call, Sistani's fatwa, mostly populated by Shias. And in terms of Iraq, there is not a fear of explosion, but a fear of implosion because of the old problems and new challenges. I mean, there were a lot of things waiting for us in the day after the Syrian crisis and the day after ISIS in terms of Iraq. There were, of course, effects of radicalization. I have to summarize in 15 minutes. That's because I will give 7 or 8 minutes to Iraq and 7 and 8 minutes to Lebanon. That's why I'm trying to be more quick. But when you have questions, I think after the all panel, we will take the questions. We have effects on radicalization because of the Syrian crisis, and the radicalized groups can be considered in 3 dimensions. The local Sunnis, which they face or they see the ISIS as a real alternative to the Shia-dominated regime. Since 2003, there were no alternatives to the Baghdad regime or the they called as a Shia-dominated regime, but they, at the first time, they see an alternative to the Shia-dominated regime. That's why the participation to ISIS is a real problem. The radicalization among local Shiites, which I will focus on the security effects, forming of Hashd al-Shabi and other militias. And there were also radicalization tendency among Kurds, which started to think its survival regarding the strengthening of Shia power or the ISIS issue. Also, we have social effects which really directly linked to the IDP issue. It's the displacement policies. The perpetrators can be ISIS, Daesh, I mean Iraqi army, the Shia militias, Peshmerga, or other armed groups. And the victims can be considered as the Sunnis, Shiites, Turkmens, Yazidis, and Kurds. I mean, all Iraqis are the victims, and perpetrators can change due to the instances. But all Iraqi people are directly affected because of this displacement policies. Even they liberated areas. I mean, even they liberated a territory from ISIS, there were still ongoing displacement and redisplacement policies to change the demographic structure, to change the demographic borders of the country. And also regarding Iraq, there were effects on economy. And when we compare the effects of the Syrian crisis on Iraq with the economy, Iraqi economy or economic effects, the short-term effects are not cannot be considered as so dramatic. But the major indirect effect of the Syrian crisis is the interruption of existing investments. Of course, it's also related to ISIS expansion or ISIS holding the territory, and I think KRG is more vulnerable to the economic effects because of not allocating the budgets from the Baghdad government to Erbil administration. And there were effects on Iraqi security, which we can say that Iraq developed two short-term responses for the challenge or to manage the challenge to its security. The first one is, which I mentioned earlier, is the formation of Hashd al-Shabi, but the second one is the asking for military support from the other countries. And for the second response, we can consider it in four headlines, which one is the short-term light arms and ammunition aid and plus training with Germany, Turkey, and several countries, more than 12 countries contributed. The basic and improved arms sales, which the United States, Russia, and somehow Iran, despite the sanctions, contributed. The weapons and active field operative support, which can be considered solely by Iran. I mean, everyone knows the Qasem Soleimani, what he is doing in Iran now, in Iraq now, and of course the air support of the coalition. Without the air support of coalition, Iraq cannot resist to the ISIS attacks. Let me quote one of the high-level official in Iraq. He says that without coalition's air support, for instance, Kirkuk cannot resist to Daesh attacks in one day. Cannot resist for one day to the Daesh attacks. So the coalition air support is really important, and also the Iranian influence, the growing Iranian influence will bear some negative or positive consequences for the future of Iraq. And there are two possible risks regarding Iraq. The first one is the future of Hashd al-Shabi, which has more fighting capability than the Iraqi army. After the removal of ISIS threat, what will we do with the Hashd al-Shabi? Will it become a regular force? Will it become or transform to a national guard? What will we do with the Hashd al-Shabi? It's a real challenge for the future of Iraq. And the other one is the re-emergence of the pre-crisis tensions between Baghdad and Erbil. Because we will see a more strong, in military terms, Baghdad after the crisis, and more experienced KRG Peshmergas after the crisis. So what will we do about the ongoing tensions or the pre-crisis tensions? What will the status of Kirkuk be? Will Peshmerga withdraw from Kirkuk? Will Hashd al-Shabi let them to stay in Kirkuk? There are a lot of questions to be answered, and these can be the risks or the challenge which Iraq will face in the near future. So let me focus on Lebanon now. We have we have the same effects in Lebanon, but we have also the different outcomes. The previous experiences of Lebanon determined, or is the basic factor to determine the refugee response to the Syrian crisis. Even I'm saying that Lebanon is only hosting 22% of the refugees. When you consider it with the population ratio, we can say that Lebanon is one of the most populous refugee hosting countries in terms of ratio in the world now. So the refugee burden Lebanon shoulders means 18 million refugees in Turkey, 8 million Syrians in Iraq, or 75 million Syrians in the United States. So even the number is less when you compare it with Turkey. The shoulder Lebanon, the burden Lebanon is shouldering is really important. And regarding the effects of the Syrian crisis on state structure of Lebanon, we can say that, like Iraq, the ongoing problems also contribute to the effects on the state structure, and the approach of Lebanese political actors towards the crisis dismantled the state structure in Lebanon. When the crisis was ongoing, the caretaker government, there was a caretaker government in Lebanon from May 2013 till 2014. As we all know, the parliamentary elections were postponed till 2017, and Lebanon now elects a president. The president office is vacant due to the developments about the Syrian crisis. And of course, there is no need to mention the malfunction of basic services, including the other things. Regarding the effects on state structure, we shouldn't forget the Baghdad Declaration, which is, I think, really important, but especially one actor, which you all know, that Hezbollah is now involved in the Syrian crisis, and of course it will have negative repercussions in terms of state structure and as well as the other dimensions in Lebanon, in our opinion. There were effects on radicalization in Lebanon, which radicalization effect can be seen among four main groups: the Lebanese Shia, the Lebanese Sunnis, the Lebanese Nusayris. Even their number is low when you consider it, when you compare with the Sunnis and the Shias. It's about 100,000, and they are mostly populated in the northern part of the country. And the potential radicalization is for Syrians seeking shelter in Lebanon. Only 10% of radicalized Syrians can be a really big problem for Lebanese politics, but before it, I think the Shia radicalization and the Sunni radicalization is one of the important aspects which should be studied on it because of their involvement. I mean the Hezbollah's involvement and also the Sunni participation to the opposition groups. Not only opposition groups, I mean not only moderate opposition, but also to the radicalized Salafist movements, ISIS, Daesh, and Al-Nusra. The social effects of the crisis on Lebanon also can be evaluated in three dimensions, or in the report we evaluated it in three dimensions. Effects of effects to the Syrians living in Lebanon, the local reactions towards dominant political factions' engagement to the crisis. I mean especially Hezbollah's engagement to the crisis, and other attitudes of other Lebanese ethnic or religious groups which has started to engage in both with the other parties and somehow trying to pursue a wait-and-see policy or like that. The economic effects of the Syrian crisis in Lebanon, there are two arguments. As Dr. Peter told. One side claims the negative economic effects by using macro data. It costs about $7.5 billion. We all know the numbers. While the others admit the negative effects, but believe it has also positively effects on Lebanese economy. We should not forget, when we consider the refugee burden in Lebanon, we should not forget the Syrians already residing or working in Lebanon before the crisis. There were about 300 to 500,000 Syrians working in Lebanon. Before the crisis, they were they get used to send their earnings to Syria, to their families, but with the crisis, they mostly bring their families to Lebanon, and now they are spending their earnings in Lebanon. So there are negative and positive effects of the crisis in terms of Lebanon. And of course, there were effects on security. We evaluated the security effects in three main dimensions. One is direct dimension, which is directly related to the Lebanese army and domestic security. The crisis in Syria has underscored the need for a strong Lebanese army. I mean, the seek for trust to the army increased with the crisis. And of course, there were positive and negative consequences of Hezbollah's role in Syria. And indirectly, there is the risk of strengthening of radical actors inside Lebanon when we consider the Ersal issue, for instance, or other potential places. These are all directly effects, can be considered as the effects on Lebanese security because of the Syrian crisis. Now I will stop here and give the floor to Oytun to focus on the Syrian crisis effects on Turkey and Jordan.